In this video, we're going to be discussing cognitive development in infancy. And really the place to start with this discussion is with a man named Piaget. So his name was Jean Piaget, which is a French name, but he was actually Swiss. He lived in Switzerland. Those are the years that he lived. He is really a monumental figure in developmental psychology because he was among the first people to think about and research children's thinking. So if you remember an earlier discussion in the class about children being thought of as little adults, Piaget was somebody who said that is absolutely not the case. Children think about the world in much different ways than adults do. And so he spent a lot of his life really researching kids. He started off researching his own kids. In the picture you see at the bottom here, these are not his own kids, but he always enjoyed being around kids and watching them and talking with them and really trying to figure out the way that they think and the way that they think about the world. One of the big contributions from Piaget is the notion of a schema. A schema, according to Piaget, is a mental understanding or representation of something. And we start to develop these as young children. So as an adult now, you have schemas for any number of thousands, probably millions of different things. For example, when you were a child, you first developed, you probably don't remember it, but you developed schemas for everyday objects like a rubber band. At some point in your life, you first encountered a rubber band. Someone told you what a rubber band was. You started to realize, the different properties of a rubber band, what it can do, what it is made of, how it can stretch, et cetera, et cetera. And you have this idea in your head now of what a rubber band is. You don't have to have a picture in front of you, like's on this slide, to understand what a rubber band is. You have a notion in your mind of what a rubber band is, and that's a schema. Another schema you have is a schema of a dog. There's all kinds of different dogs, different colors, shapes, sizes of dogs, but you have an idea in your head about what makes an animal a dog. And you develop those schemas, the schema of a dog and all the schemas you have for everyday objects as a child. All right. So Piaget was a theorist who was a stage theorist. We talked about Freud earlier in the class. He had his, of course, psychosexual stages. Erikson had his psychosocial stages. Piaget had stages of cognitive development. And he thinks that we all progress through these in a certain order. The first stage that he discussed was what he called the sensorimotor stage. And this goes from birth to about 2 years of age. And to understand the sensorimotor stage, you really just need to look at the word here, sensory and motor. Okay. So Piaget thought that the sensorimotor stage was all about kids experiencing the world through their senses and their actions. So the motor, the movement part. Okay. So in the sensorimotor stage, which we're going to talk about in more depth here in a minute, kids are, crawling around, they're putting things in their mouths, they're touching things, they're just really starting to form some schemas of things in the world through their senses. We move on from the sensorimotor stage to the pre-operational stage, another really interesting stage of cognitive development in childhood. We'll discuss this later in the class, but this is roughly 2 to 6, so, sort of preschool age. And one of the interesting things that Piaget discovered about children at this age is they do not understand concrete logic. So you can have discussions with kids. They can certainly speak and talk, and they have a vocabulary by the time they're 2, but they really don't understand a lot about how the world works, And one way this comes into play is with magical thinking. So, a lot of kids will just believe you when you tell them, oh, that's magic. So imagine this little girl here is talking with her mother. They're bringing out some Christmas lights, and the girl asks how the lights work. And her mom, maybe not really understanding that herself, just kind of says, oh, it's magic. And that satisfies the little girl. Okay. Kids at this age, they'll believe a lot of different things, like a dog can turn into a cat. And, they just think that people may have magical powers. We may like to watch movies about that as adults or fantasy cartoons or whatever. But we realize that that really cannot happen. But kids at this age, they don't quite have a grasp on how the world works. So they really get into the magical thinking. When we get a little bit older, we progress to the concrete operational stage, according to Piaget. So this is 7 to 11 years old. This is elementary school age. And so kids understand a lot more about the world at this point. So they're not going to buy the magical thinking stuff anymore. You know, if you tell a kid who's 10 years old, oh, hey, that's magic, that doesn't satisfy them. But the thing about kids in this age is they think about concrete events. So what Piaget meant by concrete events are things that are pretty cut and dry, things that they're tangible, you know, ideas and concepts that are sort of visible and things you can see. When you start talking about abstract things, you know, like concepts like freedom and justice and things like that, things that you can't touch, things you can't see, necessarily. Kids in the concrete operational stage have a difficult time with that. Eventually, we progress to the formal operational stage, according to Piaget. So this kicks in somewhere around when adolescence starts and goes through the adult years. So we would all be in the formal operational stage, according to Piaget, as adults. And this is when we are able to think about abstract concepts. So you can kind of have an understanding of, you know, some of those concepts I was mentioning earlier, for example, like what does freedom really mean? You know, I can't really see freedom, but what does that mean? Supposedly, when we're in the formal operational stage, those kinds of abstract concepts are easier for us to grasp. But I want to hone in on, go back to and talk in some more depth about this first stage, the sensorimotor stage, because that's really what applies to infancy, and that's the topic of our chapter here. So again, the sensorimotor stage, remember, kids are exploring the world through their senses. In a previous video, I talked about gross and fine motor skills and motor abilities. So the 0 to 2 years, there's a lot that happens here cognitively, according to Piaget, and he actually breaks the sensorimotor stage down into substages. And the first substage is what he calls the simple reflexes, or the reflexes substage. And these are all, again, substages of the sensorimotor stage. Okay. So in the simple reflexes substage, this is just the first month of our life. So this goes by relatively quickly. But there's not a lot of thinking going on here. And what we're doing, according to Piaget, is just kind of coordinating some of those reflexes. If you think back to the discussion we had about, you know, the reflexes we're born with, like the rooting reflex and the swallowing reflex and the sucking reflex, really just kind of getting all that stuff together and coordinated so we can feed and so we can survive is really what's on our mind at that point, according to Piaget. Okay. We move on to the next substage in the sensorimotor stage. This one is called the primary circular reaction stage. This one's a little more involved and a little more interesting. So this would be about age 1 month to 4 months. And what happens here is these young children focus on repetitive actions that involve their body. For example, and this is pretty simple, but at this point it's thinking. It's how we're thinking, according to Piaget. So, you know, just putting our finger in our mouth, like you see this little baby here doing, or touching our nose, you know, doing something with our own bodies that we find kind of interesting. You know, it tastes interesting maybe when I put my finger in my mouth, or it feels interesting. I can feel that on my finger. I can feel it on my tongue. And so we find something that is pleasurable or interesting, like a really simple thing, like putting our finger in our mouth or touching our nose. And a lot of times that just happens by chance. You know, babies are kind of moving around and oop, that finger goes in the mouth. And then what makes it the primary circular reactions substage is we try to repeat that. So that's where the circular part comes in. And believe it or not, it takes a whole lot of thinking at this point to be able to consciously try to put your finger in your mouth. And so that's kind of where we are in those early months of our lives. All right. If we move on and then talk about the next substage, Piaget calls this one the secondary circular reaction stage. This would be 4 to 8 months of age. And what's happening here is a similar thing. So we find something that's kind of interesting or pleasurable, but instead of just involving the outside, instead of just involving our own bodies, it starts to involve the outside world. So for example, a kid makes an interesting sound, maybe kind of by accident. So, but let's say they're just kind of sitting in a high chair and they smack the table, and they think that's kind of cool. They like the sound. They like maybe the way it feels on their hand. And so that they try to repeat that. A really simple example of this too would be to shake a rattle. Okay. And, that's a classic baby toy, is to shake a rattle. But the reason kids like that is because, it's an interesting sound. They're controlling it. And so they try to repeat that. And I found this crazy picture of a rattle that looks like a martini, but this kid, seems to be enjoying holding that and, making the sound, controlling the sound that it makes when he shakes it. All right. We move on to the next substage here. And this one is called the coordination of secondary reactions substage. And remember, we're still in the sensorimotor stage. And this one is 8 to 12 months. Again, getting increasingly sophisticated here in our thinking and what we're able to do. So what's happening in this substage is the young child is combining 2 or more things previously learned. So a good example of that is a toy on a string, or a toy that rolls that's attached to a string. A kid may have learned, for example, that, things on strings, if I grab onto the string and I pull it, the object will come towards me. That's one thing. They may also have learned that toys and things that are on wheels, they will roll, and they can kind of come to me a little more easily than things that aren't on wheels. So let's say they spot a toy like this for the first time that's on wheels and it has a string. They kind of put those together and think, hey, I bet if I grab that string and pull that string that's attached to that wheeled object, it will come to me pretty easily. Now, again, this may not seem like very sophisticated thinking to you, and it's not. But at this stage, it really is, because, we're combining things together that we previously learned. All right. Moving on. The next substage Piaget discusses is the tertiary circular reaction stage. So tertiary, just so you know, means third, or there's no real word of this, but tertiary, I guess. So you have secondary and then you have tertiary. And what happens in the tertiary circular reaction substage is kids become interested in the different properties of objects. So notice the age here, 12 to 18 months. Kids in this substage are able to walk for the most part, or beginning to walk. They can certainly crawl, and they're curious about things. They're curious about the properties of things, right? So Piaget described kids, especially at this age, as little scientists, little experimenters. So they encounter things in the world, and their world may largely be the home, the house, and they want to figure out what these things can do. A really simple example of that is, playing with a ball. So the great thing about a ball, I don't know if you've ever thought about it like this, but the great thing about a ball, especially a bouncy ball, is there's so many different things you can do with it. You can roll it, you can throw it, you can catch it, you can bounce it. And in the tertiary circular reactions substage here, kids would be really interested in all the different things a ball can do. Now, kids get into trouble in this substage too. As you see here, these kids discovered some paint and kind of made a huge mess in the house. And kids, especially if you turn your back for a minute at this age, will really do that kind of thing. So it's a really big thing for a lot of kids in this substage they get be fascinated with the toilet. They may be starting toilet training, but many kids are fascinated with the fact that the toilet, you press this lever and things just vanish, right? And so they may try to flush things down the toilet or see what can be flushed down the toilet. And sometimes you get these big plumbing bills from when kids try to flush things down the toilet. All right. But the point is, they're curious and they want to they come across something and they're like, hey, what all can this thing do? That is the heart of the tertiary circular reaction substage. Okay. Now we move on to the final substage here. And this one Piaget called the internalization of schemas. And so this is 18 to 24 months, so up to 2 years of age here. But our thinking gets a step more sophisticated. And children here are very curious about objects in the world, just like they were in the previous substage. But they start to think more symbolically about things and maybe don't have to try everything out. Okay? So, instead of like doing a hands-on experiment with every new object, they can think about those objects and maybe sort of figure some things out in their head without having to do, like I said, the hands-on kind of experimentation. So, back to the toilet example for a minute. A child may, we'll say that the parent has been pretty strict about the toilet, even though the kid is really curious about it. A child may have formed a hypothesis in their mind. Well, I've seen smaller things go down the toilet maybe, so I bet a grape I could flush down there, but not big things like a TV remote. So this kid is not in the internalization of schemas substage, probably, because this child is actually trying to flush a remote down the toilet. But when you're in this substage, internalization of schemas, you can sort of start to think about things without having to do the experiment to figure out if they're going to work. Okay. So that was kind of a quick overview of the sensorimotor stage. And just again, the substages are the simple reflexes substage, the primary circular reaction substage, the secondary circular reaction substage, the coordination of secondary reaction substage, the tertiary circular reaction substage, and then finally the internalization of schemas substage. And if you just kind of think about them all together, or maybe think about this stage to this stage, we come a long way in those first 2 years. So remember, back here, we're just not really thinking very much. We're just kind of coordinating those reflexes so that we can eat and survive. And we move all the way down here to be able to think about things mentally without having to actually do a hands-on kind of a thing to understand. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit better about these substages and Piaget's sensorimotor stage.